Atlas did not stop because he was afraid. He stopped because something in that silent shelter had just called him by a name no stranger should have known. Rain slid down the front windows of Haven Ridge Animal Shelter in thin, silver lines, blurring the parking lot into a wash of gray pavement, wet gravel, and trembling porch lights. Inside, the air held the clean, lonely smell of old disinfectant, damp blankets, and stainless steel bowls that had been washed too many times by tired hands. Caleb Rose stepped through the front door with his German shepherd at his side, his boots leaving dark half-moons on the worn tile. He was a white former U.S. Marine with quiet eyes, broad shoulders, and the kind of stillness that made people lower their voices without knowing why. He had come here to help with a routine intake, nothing more. A shelter 2 counties over had closed suddenly, and Haven Ridge had taken in the dogs nobody else had room for. Caleb knew what forgotten looked like. He had seen it in empty kennels, in old collars with no tags, in animals that flinched from kindness because kindness had become unfamiliar. Atlas usually handled shelters with calm purpose. He would sniff the floor, glance at the cages, then look back at Caleb as if asking where the work began. But that afternoon was different. From the moment they entered the kennel wing, the silence felt wrong. Not peaceful, not sleeping, waiting. Rows of dogs watched from behind chain-link doors, their eyes following Caleb and Atlas as they moved under the flicker of fluorescent lights. Somewhere, a water bowl clicked softly against concrete. A ventilation fan hummed above them like a distant engine. Caleb rested 2 fingers against Atlas's collar, feeling the shepherd's steady warmth beneath his hand. "Easy boy," he murmured. Atlas did not look at him. His ears had lifted. His body had gone still. At the far end of the hall, where the light faded near a storage room door, one last kennel sat half-shadowed. The card clipped to it was bent from moisture. The name line was blank except for a number written in black marker. 17. Inside, curled on a thin blue blanket, lay an old German shepherd with a silvered muzzle and a tired sable coat dulled by years. He did not rise when Caleb approached. He did not bark. He only opened his eyes. Atlas took 1 step forward, then froze so completely that Caleb felt the leash tighten without a sound. The old dog stared at Atlas as if he had been waiting through every winter of his life for that exact shape to appear in the hallway. Then his chest moved. A low, broken sound came from him, not a bark, not a whine, but a soft pattern of breath and voice, 3 uneven notes that made Caleb's hand go cold. It was the old recall rhythm from Caleb's K9 unit, a sound used when commands had to be hidden under wind, distance, and fear. Caleb had not heard it in 7 years. Atlas knew it too. The shepherd's nose trembled. His eyes locked on the dog behind the door. The rain tapped harder against the roof, and for 1 long second, the whole shelter seemed to hold its breath. Caleb leaned closer to the kennel card, but there was no name, no history, no answer. Only the number 17, scratched plastic, and a forgotten dog looking straight at Atlas like he had just found his way back from a place no one was supposed to return from. Caleb Rowe had built his life after the service around quiet routines, because quiet was the only thing that did not ask him questions. Most mornings began before sunrise in the small white house he rented outside Asheville, North Carolina, where the Blue Ridge air came down cool through the trees and the porch boards creaked under Atlas's paws. Caleb would make black coffee in an old metal pot, lace his work boots, and stand at the kitchen window while the first pale light touched the fence line. Atlas always waited beside the back door, calm and straight-backed, his amber eyes following every movement with the patience of a partner who had learned the language of silence. The house was simple. 1 bedroom, a narrow kitchen, a living room with a worn brown couch, and a folded American flag kept in a wooden case on the mantel. There were no framed medals on the walls, no photographs arranged for visitors, no proud display of what Caleb had once been. The only thing that looked deliberately placed was a single empty hook beside the mudroom door. It was brass, tarnished at the edges, and it held nothing. Years ago, that hook had held Bishop's collar. Caleb never took the hook down. He told himself it was because he kept forgetting. But some things stay because forgetting them would feel like a second goodbye. During the day, Caleb worked part-time at Miller's Garage, a low-brick building off Highway 74 where the smell of motor oil, tire rubber, and strong coffee clung to everything. He was good with engines because engines made sense. If something failed, there was a reason. A loose belt, a cracked hose, a dead battery. People were harder. Memory was harder. Guilt was the hardest thing of all, because it kept running even when there was nothing left to repair. Atlas stayed nearby when the garage owner allowed it, lying under Caleb's workbench with his head on his paws, watching strangers come and go through the open bay doors. Children sometimes asked to pet him. Caleb always looked to Atlas first. If the shepherd leaned forward, Caleb nodded. If Atlas stayed still, Caleb said, "Not today, buddy." He trusted the dog's judgment more than his own some days. In the evenings, when the garage closed and the mountain roads turned blue with dusk, Caleb drove to local shelters to help with the dogs nobody rushed to adopt. The old ones, the nervous ones, the ones with cloudy eyes, stiff joints, missing papers, and names that had been changed so many times they no longer answered to anything. He cleaned kennels, fixed loose gates, carried 50-pound food bags, and sat quietly outside cages until frightened animals understood that he was not there to take anything from them. Atlas came with him always. Some dogs calmed just seeing him. Others pressed against the wire as if recognizing something steady and ancient in his posture. Caleb never called it therapy. He did not like words that tried to make pain sound organized. He only knew that when he was useful, the old weight in his chest loosened. But at night, after the work was done, the past still found its way in. Sometimes Atlas would wake from sleep with a low sound in his throat, not alarmed, not angry, but answering. Caleb would sit up in the dark and listen. The sound always came in the same broken rhythm, 3 soft notes, separated by breath. It was the rhythm Bishop had used in the field when he wanted Atlas to follow without a full command. Caleb remembered Bishop as he had been, broad-chested, sharp-eyed, sable coat shining under the training yard sun, older than Atlas by 3 years and respected by every handler who had ever worked beside him. Bishop had carried himself like a captain. Atlas, young then, had followed him everywhere. They trained together, ate within sight of each other, slept nose to tail during long waits, and seemed to speak in glances no human could fully read. When Bishop disappeared during that final mission overseas, Caleb accepted the report because soldiers are taught to accept reports. Presumed lost. No recovery. No further action. But Atlas never accepted it. And maybe, in the deepest part of himself, neither did Caleb. That was why, when the old dog in Kennel 17 made that sound inside Haven Ridge Animal Shelter, Caleb did not feel surprise first. He felt the door of 7 years open behind him, and the life he had built so carefully went suddenly, impossibly still. The shelter manager called him number 17 because that was the only name left on the intake sheet. Her name was Marlene Price, a woman in her late 50s with tired blue eyes, gray hair pinned at the back of her neck, and hands that carried the small scratches of a life spent reaching gently into frightened places. She stood a few feet behind Caleb now, holding a clipboard close to her chest, as if paper could explain what the old German shepherd had just done. "He came in 3 nights ago," she said softly. "Transfer van from the closing facility near Knoxville. We got 16 dogs with records, but him." She looked toward the kennel. His file was almost empty. Caleb did not answer. Atlas remained planted in front of the wired door, his body rigid, his breathing slow and deep. The old dog inside had lowered his head again, but his eyes stayed fixed on Atlas. They were cloudy with age, yet something beneath them was awake. Not wild, not confused. Remembering. Marlene turned a page on the clipboard. The paper made a dry whisper in the hall. They had him listed as senior male, shepherd mix, limited handling, unknown background. No real name. No medical history beyond the basics. Someone wrote that he does not respond well to new people, but he has never snapped at anyone here. He just shuts down. She swallowed. He lies there like he is waiting for someone who stopped coming. Caleb finally looked at her. And the number? 17 was his kennel number during transport. We needed something to call him. Her voice thinned with embarrassment. "I know it is not much." Caleb understood that. In shelters, names sometimes came after survival. First came water, food, a clean blanket, a door that closed safely, a human voice that did not rush. Still, the number on the card felt colder than the concrete beneath his boots. The old shepherd had a face made of weather and patience. His sable coat was faded along the shoulders, with silver tracing his muzzle and brow. One ear stood higher than the other. His ribs were not sharp, but he was lean in the way older working dogs sometimes became, all history and bone-deep discipline. He wore no collar. Around his neck, the fur sat slightly flattened, as if something had rested there for years before being taken away. Atlas took another step closer. The old dog lifted his head again. Caleb saw the movement clearly this time. Not fear, not curiosity, recognition. A small tremor passed through Atlas's shoulders. It was nearly invisible, but Caleb felt it through the leash. In all the years since he had brought Atlas home, he had seen the dog face thunderstorms, crowded sidewalks, barking kennels, and loud engines without losing himself. But now Atlas looked young again, almost uncertain, as if some hidden room inside him had opened and he did not know whether to enter. Caleb crouched beside him, bringing himself level with the wire. "Hey," he whispered, not to the old dog alone, but to both of them. "Easy." The old shepherd's gaze shifted for the first time. He looked at Caleb's face, then at Caleb's hand, then back to Atlas. His nose twitched. Once, twice. Caleb slowly raised his palm, stopping a few inches from the kennel door. He did not push his fingers through. He knew better than to ask Trust to hurry. The hallway seemed to narrow around that offered hand. Rain tapped the roof. A dog coughed somewhere near the front rooms. The old shepherd leaned forward just enough for Caleb to hear his breathing. Then, very gently, he made the sound again. 3 uneven notes, low and worn, shaped by memory more than strength. Atlas answered with a quiet whine that broke something open in Caleb's chest. Marlene covered her mouth with one hand. "He has not made a sound since he got here," she said. Caleb's eyes stayed on the old dog. "He has been saving it," he murmured. Marlene looked down at her papers again, searching for anything that might matter. There was a plastic bin that came with him. "I have not gone through all of it yet. Some old fabric, broken gear, maybe a tag. We were short-staffed, and he would not let anyone close enough to check him for long." Caleb stood slowly. The word tag moved through him like a bell struck underwater. Atlas did not move with him. The shepherd remained at the kennel door, nose almost touching the wire, staring into the eyes of a forgotten K9 who had somehow carried a name through 7 silent years. Marlene led Caleb toward the storage room at the end of the kennel wing, but Atlas refused to follow. The leash drew tight, not with disobedience, but with a plea so clear Caleb felt it before he understood it. Atlas stood before Kennel 17, ears forward, tail low, every muscle pointed toward the old shepherd behind the wire. Caleb stopped. The shelter lights hummed overhead, pale and restless. Beyond the windows, rain dragged silver lines down the glass, and the late afternoon had turned the parking lot into a blur of wet asphalt and yellow reflections. "All right," Caleb whispered. He unclipped the leash from Atlas's collar. "Stay close." Atlas did not move away from the kennel. Marlene watched him with a careful sadness. "That dog has ignored everyone," she said. "Volunteers, staff, even the veterinarian. He would eat only after we left the bowl and walked out. But your dog," she did not finish. "Some things sounded foolish until they happened in front of you." Caleb stepped closer to the kennel door and lowered himself again, slowly, knees bending with the quiet discipline of someone who knew sudden movements could break fragile trust. The old shepherd watched him, then looked past him to Atlas. That was when Caleb noticed something else. The old dog was not only watching Atlas. He was waiting for Atlas to give permission. Caleb's throat tightened. He remembered a training yard under a hard white sun, Atlas still young, all oversized paws and eagerness, while Bishop stood beside him like an older brother carved from patience. Bishop had always corrected without cruelty. A glance, a shoulder nudge, a calm presence that taught younger dogs the difference between fear and focus. Caleb had forgotten the exact sound of those days, but his body had not. The click of kennel gates, the smell of dry grass, the warm weight of 2 shepherds leaning against his legs after drills. "Marlene," Caleb said, keeping his voice low, "does this door have a second latch?" "Yes. Top slide and lower pin. Open the top only." Slowly. Marlene hesitated. "Caleb, I do not know how he will react." Caleb kept his eyes on the old shepherd. "Neither does he." The sentence settled between them. Marlene moved carefully to the door and touched the upper latch. Metal whispered against metal. Atlas shifted one paw forward. The old dog rose. Not all at once. First his head lifted, then his shoulders, Then his hind legs pushed beneath him with the stiffness of age and long uncertainty. He stood in the half-shadow, taller than he had looked while curled on the blanket, his frame lean but still noble beneath the faded coat. When the latch clicked free, the whole row of kennels seemed to listen. A small brown terrier near the front stopped pacing. Somewhere a water bowl stilled. Caleb raised his right hand, palm open. It was an old gesture, older than grief, older than the empty hook beside his mudroom door. The old shepherd stared at it. His ears trembled. Caleb said the command before he could stop himself. Not loudly, not for show, just one soft word from a life he thought had ended. Hold. The old dog sat. Marlene took in a sharp breath. Atlas gave a low whine, the kind that sounded almost human when the heart was too full for silence. Caleb could not move. 7 years disappeared in one obedient motion. Not proof. Not yet. But something close enough to make the air feel thin. The old shepherd remained seated, chest rising and falling, eyes fixed on Caleb now. Caleb slowly lowered his hand. Release. The dog stood. Marlene pressed the clipboard against her chest, as though it might steady her. That is not a shelter command, she whispered. Caleb shook his head once. No, he said. It is not. Atlas stepped forward until his nose nearly touched the wire. The old shepherd leaned toward him, and for the first time, their noses met through the small square opening between the bars. Neither dog barked. Neither pulled away. They simply breathed each other in, searching through years, through lost roads and wrong names, through every place that had failed to remember what they had once been. Caleb turned toward the storage room, his voice barely above the rain. Show me the bin. Marlene returned with a clear plastic bin that looked too ordinary to hold a ghost. Its lid was cracked along one corner, sealed with a strip of yellowing tape, and marked only with the same black number as the kennel card. 17. She set it on a folding table near the laundry shelves, where clean towels sat in uneven stacks and the dryer breathed warm air into the cold back room. Caleb stood over the bin for a moment without touching it. His hands, steady around engines and frightened dogs, felt suddenly too large for the small things inside. Atlas had followed him only after Caleb promised with a glance that they were not leaving the old shepherd behind. Now Atlas stood in the doorway between the storage room and the kennel hall, body turned toward Caleb, eyes turned toward Kennel 17. Torn between memory and proof. Marlene peeled back the tape. The sound was soft, but Caleb felt it under his ribs. Inside the bin lay a folded piece of faded green fabric, a worn nylon strap, a small rubber training ball cracked from age, and a collar so weathered it had nearly lost its original color. Caleb reached for the fabric first. It was stiff in places, stained by time and dust, but when he unfolded it, a faint stitched patch appeared along the corner. Not a name, not a unit, just 3 white lines crossing at an angle. Caleb stopped breathing. He knew that mark. Years ago, one of the handlers had sewn it by hand onto extra field cloth after a supply delay. It was not official. It was not recorded anywhere. It was the kind of small human thing that survives only if someone remembers. Caleb pressed his thumb over the thread, and the storage room seemed to fade. He saw Bishop lying beside Atlas under a canvas shade, the 2 dogs sharing a bowl of water after a long training day. He saw Bishop carrying that same piece of cloth in his mouth, proud as if it were a medal. He saw Atlas trying to steal it, and Bishop turning away with patient dignity. Caleb, Marlene asked. Her voice came from far off. He set the cloth down carefully and picked up the collar. The buckle was dull. The fabric was frayed where a tag had once rubbed against it. Hanging from the metal ring was half of a dog tag, rusted along the break. Caleb wiped it with his sleeve. At first there was only grime. Then the letters began to appear, one by one, thin and stubborn beneath the years. BIS. Marlene leaned closer. Does that mean something? Caleb's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed low. It is the beginning of a name. Atlas came into the room then, slow and silent. He did not sniff the ball or the collar. He went straight to the broken tag and lowered his nose until it touched the metal. His eyes closed. For a moment, he looked less like a working dog and more like an old friend standing at a doorway he had never stopped guarding. Caleb reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers already moving towards something he had carried for years without telling anyone. A small leather pouch. He opened it and took out the other half of a tag, wrapped in soft cloth. He had kept it through 3 moves, 2 jobs, and every night he pretended he had made peace with the past. The edge was jagged. The metal was dark. When he placed it beside the half from the bin, the pieces met imperfectly, but close enough for the full name to breathe again. Bishop. Marlene made a small sound, then covered it with her hand. Caleb stared at the tag as if it might vanish if he blinked. There were no trumpets, no sudden answer from heaven, just a drier humming, rain falling, and Atlas standing motionless beside a plastic bin while a lost name returned to the room. Caleb folded both halves into his palm. Where did they transfer him from before Knoxville? He asked. Marlene looked down at the intake papers. There were 2 facilities before that. Maybe 3. Records are messy. Caleb nodded, but his eyes had changed. The uncertainty was still there. So was the ache. But beneath it, something older had risen. Duty. Not the kind written on orders. The kind that begins when a living soul has been misplaced, and somebody finally remembers enough to go looking. From the kennel hall came one quiet sound. 3 worn notes. Bishop was calling again. This time, Caleb answered with his hand closed around the name he should never have lost. Caleb did not ask Marlene for answers she did not have. He only asked for the phone, the transfer forms, and a quiet place to read. She brought him into the small office behind the front desk, where a space heater clicked under a metal filing cabinet and the walls were covered with faded adoption photos. Atlas lay beside the chair, but his head stayed turned toward the kennel hall. Caleb spread the papers across the desk. Facility names, intake numbers, dates that did not line up, handwritten notes copied from older handwritten notes until the truth had become thin and hard to hold. Bishop had not arrived at Haven Ridge as Bishop. Before number 17, he had been listed as Shepherd Male Sr. Before that, Old Scout. Before that, no name at all. Caleb followed the trail backward through county lines, closed shelters, temporary holding farms, and one private contractor that had handled retired working dogs years earlier. Marlene called everyone she could. Some numbers were disconnected. Some offices had changed staff. Some records were stored in boxes nobody had opened since the pandemic years. Caleb listened to hold music that sounded too cheerful for the weight in the room. He wrote every detail in a notebook with the same careful hand he once used for maintenance logs. Atlas did not sleep. Every few minutes, the old sound came from the kennel hall, faint but steady, and Atlas lifted his ears as if counting each note. Near dusk, a woman from a county records office in eastern Tennessee returned Marlene's call. Her voice came through the speakerphone with a tired kindness. She had found an archived transfer record from 7 years earlier. A senior K-9 had been moved under an emergency classification after a military subcontractor closed its regional kennel program. The dog had no complete identification because several tags had been damaged and the scanned paperwork was incomplete. Caleb leaned over the desk, his palm flat on the wood. Was there a source unit? He asked. The woman paused. Papers shifted on her end of the line. It says attached to a federal working dog support program, then released to civilian rehabilitation after separation from handler records. I am sorry, sir. It looks like the name field was corrupted. Only the first 3 letters were readable. Caleb closed his eyes. BIS. The line went quiet. Yes, she said softly. No one in the office moved. Rainwater ticked from Caleb's jacket sleeve onto the floor. Marlene looked at him with the helpless sorrow of someone realizing that kindness had arrived years late, but not too late. The woman continued, explaining what the paperwork could explain and nothing more. Bishop had not been declared gone because someone meant to erase him. He had been misplaced by distance, rushed transfers, failed systems, and records that treated living memory like a broken file. He had passed from one place to another, always older, always quieter, always losing pieces of himself in the language of forms. Caleb thanked her, though the words felt small. When the call ended, the office seemed colder. He sat back and stared at the 2 halves of the tag on the desk. There was no villain to face, no single door to break open. Only 7 years of nobody asking the right question at the right time. That hurt in a different way. It had no shape. Atlas stood suddenly. His nails clicked once on the floor. From the kennel hall came Bishop's voice again, weaker now, but unmistakable. 3 notes, a question and a prayer. Caleb gathered the tag halves, the old collar, and the faded cloth. He walked back through the shelter with Atlas at his side, past the watching dogs, past the clean bowls, past the blank cards waiting for names. At Kennel 17, Bishop was standing. His body trembled, but his eyes were clear. Caleb knelt in front of the door and held up the broken tag, where Bishop could see it. "I know," Caleb whispered. "I know who you are." Bishop pressed his nose to the wire, breathing over Caleb's fingers, and Atlas leaned against Caleb's shoulder as if holding him upright. In that narrow hallway, under buzzing lights and a leaking roof, the truth finally arrived without anger. Bishop had not failed to come home. The world had failed to call him by his name. Marlene unlocked the kennel door with both hands, as if she were opening something older than metal. The lower pin slid free first. Then the upper latch lifted with a small tired click that traveled down the hallway and seemed to reach every waiting dog. Caleb stayed on one knee, the broken tag folded safely in his palm, his other hand open near his chest. He did not reach in. He did not call again. Some reunions needed room to decide whether they were real. Atlas stood beside him, still and watchful, his shoulder pressed lightly against Caleb's arm. Inside the kennel, Bishop did not move at first. He stood on the thin blue blanket with his head lowered, eyes moving from Caleb to Atlas, then to the open door. Freedom should have been simple. A step, a breath, a choice. But for a dog who had been passed from place to place, who had learned that doors opened for leaving as often as for coming home, even kindness could look like another uncertain road. Caleb understood that too well. He lowered his voice until it was barely more than breath. "No rush, Bishop." The old shepherd's ears twitched at the name. Not the number, not the blank card. The name. Atlas took one slow step into the kennel. Marlene tensed, but Caleb lifted 2 fingers gently, asking her to wait. Atlas moved with the careful grace of a dog approaching memory itself. He did not crowd Bishop. He did not push his nose under Bishop's chin or circle him the way younger dogs sometimes did. He simply stopped close enough for their whiskers to touch and lowered his head. Bishop stared at him for a long second. Then his posture softened. The change was small, but everyone saw it. His tail, held low and uncertain, moved once. Then again, Atlas leaned forward and pressed his forehead against Bishop's muzzle. The old dog closed his eyes. A sound left him, so quiet it was almost swallowed by the rain. It was not pain. It was not fear. It was relief too deep to know what shape to take. Caleb felt his own breath break. He remembered the training yard, the shade cloth snapping in a hot wind, Atlas as a young dog tumbling against Bishop's side, Bishop standing firm and patient as if he had already promised to guard him for life. Now the years sat between them like winter, and still they had found each other through one open door. Bishop took his first step out of the kennel. His paw touched the hallway floor, then stopped. Atlas turned and walked backward, one careful step at a time, guiding him without pulling. Bishop followed. Another step, then another. The shelter seemed to gather around them in silence. Marlene stood with one hand over her heart. A volunteer near the laundry shelves wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. Caleb stayed where he was, afraid that if he moved too soon, the moment might scatter. Bishop came to him slowly, his old legs stiff, his face lifted toward the hand Caleb still held open. He sniffed Caleb's palm, once, twice, and then deeper, as if searching beneath motor oil, rainwater, coffee, and years for the young Marine he had once known. Caleb did not speak. Bishop's eyes lifted to his. The recognition did not arrive like lightning. It arrived like sunrise. Quiet, certain, spreading through the dark 1 inch at a time. Then Bishop lowered his head and stepped into Caleb's chest. Caleb closed his arms around him gently, careful of age, careful of history, careful of the fragile miracle breathing against him. Atlas moved in close, pressing his body against Bishop's side, making the circle complete. Caleb bowed his head into Bishop's silvered fur. His voice, when it came, was rough and small. "You made it back." Bishop leaned harder into him, and for the first time since arriving at Haven Ridge, the forgotten K9 was not waiting at a door. He was on the other side of it. Bishop came home in the passenger seat of Caleb's old pickup, with Atlas lying across the back bench as if guarding every mile behind them. Marlene had packed a paper bag with soft food, medication instructions, a clean blanket, and the faded cloth from the bin. Caleb placed the broken tag in the cup holder where he could see it whenever the road lights flashed across the metal. Outside, the rain softened to a mist, and the mountains beyond Asheville rose dark and gentle against the evening sky. Bishop did not sleep during the drive. He sat upright though his body was tired, nose pointed toward the cracked window, breathing in pine, wet pavement, gasoline, and the faint familiar scent of Caleb's jacket. Every few minutes, Atlas leaned forward between the seats and touched his nose to Bishop's shoulder. Not checking, reassuring. Caleb kept both hands on the wheel and said very little. His heart was too full for words, and words had failed this dog long enough. When they reached the small white house, the porch light had already come on, spilling gold over the steps and the muddy yard. Bishop froze at the base of the porch. The house was not a kennel. It had no rows, no numbers, no card clipped to a door. It had the smell of old wood, coffee, machine grease, clean laundry, and one loyal dog who had lived there long enough to leave his warmth in every corner. Caleb opened the front door and waited. Atlas climbed the steps first, then stopped in the doorway and looked back. Bishop watched him. One breath. Two. Then he lifted a stiff paw and followed. Inside, the house seemed to receive him quietly. Caleb had set a thick bed beside the couch, a full water bowl near the kitchen, and a folded towel by the door. Bishop looked at each thing as if kindness were a language he used to know, but had not heard spoken in years. He did not go to the bed. He walked to the mudroom and stopped beneath the empty brass hook. Caleb saw it and felt the room tilt softly around him. The hook that had held Bishop's collar. The hook Caleb had never taken down. Atlas stood beside Bishop, shoulder touching shoulder. Bishop raised his nose toward the tarnished metal, sniffed once, and lowered his head. Caleb took the old collar from the shelter bag. It was too worn to place back on him, but he held it in both hands for a moment, then hung it on the hook. The strap settled there with a small, final sound. Not as a grave, as a witness. That night, Bishop refused the new bed. He lay near the front door with his chin on his paws, eyes open, ready for someone to move him along again. Atlas laid down beside him without hesitation. Caleb turned off the lamp, then sat in the dark on the edge of the couch, listening to two dogs breathe in different rhythms until, little by little, the older one began to match the younger one. By morning, sunlight came through the kitchen window in pale yellow squares. Caleb found them asleep back to back near the door, Atlas steady and warm, Bishop finally resting deep enough that his paws twitched in a dream. Caleb stood barefoot on the cold floor and did not move for a long time. Over the next days, the house changed by inches. Bishop learned the kitchen was safe. He learned the garage door opening did not mean abandonment. He learned that when Caleb left for work, he always came back before supper. Atlas taught him the path to the water bowl, the sunny spot under the living room window, the step on the porch that creaked, and the place near Caleb's chair where old dogs could sleep without being disturbed. Caleb learned too. He learned that healing did not arrive as a trumpet call. It came as a shepherd eating from his bowl while the rain tapped softly on the roof. It came as Atlas resting his head across Bishop's paws. It came as Caleb reaching for the empty place in his chest and finding, not peace exactly, but something close enough to begin again. 1 month later, Caleb returned to Haven Ridge with Atlas on his left and Bishop on his right. The morning was clear, washed clean after days of rain, and the shelter looked different beneath the soft Carolina sunlight. The same windows reflected the same parking lot, the same porch lights hung above the door, and the same worn tile waited inside. But the silence no longer felt like waiting. It felt like breath held gently after a prayer. Marlene saw them from the front desk and stopped with a stack of adoption forms in her hands. For a moment, she did not speak. Bishop stood taller now. His coat still carried silver. His steps were still careful, but his eyes had changed. They were no longer fixed on some faraway door. They were present, steady, and alive with the quiet dignity of a dog who had been called home and believed it. Around his neck was a new collar, dark brown leather, simple and strong. Hanging from it was not the broken tag. Caleb had kept those two halves in a small frame beside the folded flag at home. Bishop's new tag carried one word, clean and complete. Bishop. Atlas walked close enough that their shoulders brushed with every few steps. Caleb held no tension in the leash. He did not need to. The three of them moved like a small unit that had crossed a long distance together, not in miles, but in mercy. Marlene came around the desk slowly, her eyes bright. "He looks good," she said. Caleb looked down at Bishop, and something like a smile touched his face. He knows where the water bowl is now. Marlene laughed softly, the sound catching in her throat. On the wall near the kennel hallway, Caleb hung the small wooden plaque he had made in his garage. He had sanded it by hand after work, stained it the color of walnut, and burned the letters slowly into the grain. K9 Bishop. Found. Remembered. Home. He fixed it beneath the row of adoption photos. Not high, not grand, just where people passing into the kennel wing would see it. For a long moment, nobody moved. A volunteer set down a laundry basket. A young man holding a leash stopped near the office door. Somewhere in the back, a dog gave one cautious bark, then another answered, and soon the sound traveled softly down the hall, not frantic, not lonely, but alive. Bishop did not flinch. He sat between Caleb and Atlas, head raised, the morning light resting on the silver of his muzzle. Caleb placed one hand on Atlas's head and the other on Bishop's shoulders. He thought of the empty hook at home, now holding the old collar like a witness. He thought of every road Bishop had taken without knowing it was leading here. He thought of all the names the world forgets because nobody stops long enough to listen. Marlene stood beside him, looking at the plaque. Some dogs wait their whole lives for the right person to walk in, she said. Caleb kept his eyes on Bishop. Sometimes, he answered, they are waiting for the right name. Later, when they stepped back outside, the sky above the blue ridge was pale blue and wide open. Bishop paused at the shelter door and looked back once, not with fear, but as if blessing the place that had held him until memory arrived. Atlas nudged his shoulder. Caleb opened the truck door. This time, Bishop climbed in without hesitation. And as they drove away, the sunlight followed them down the road, quiet and golden, like grace finally catching up.